Hi, Ryan from Metro Hobbies. Today we're going to have a look at basic soldering. Somewhere along the line you're going to need to do some sort of soldering when you're fitting new motors into cars and such like. A bit of advice that I give anybody starting with soldering: don't skimp or cut on the price of your soldering equipment. The better the equipment is, the better the solder job you're going to be able to do, and the easier it'll be for you even as a beginner. When desoldering soldered jobs, don't just go straight onto it with the iron and sit there and wait for it to get hot enough to melt the solder, because sometimes you can do a lot of damage to other components that are connected to the point that you're soldering. So the quickest, easiest way to do it is tin your soldering tip, just a little bit of solder on. The second you put it on there, it will melt, and you can get the job away from there without overheating everything in the environment. When soldering on a new piece of wire, I generally cut the insulation off using a blade that is a little bit blunt, so that you don't end up cutting through more than just the insulation. You need to save the wires and as much of the wiring as possible. Don't need to cut off a lot, just enough to expose wire to get it ready for soldering. When tinning up a new piece of wire, get solder on the tip of your iron first, then introduce it to the wire and slowly build it up. With enough heat, it will flow into there. Don't leave it on too long, otherwise solder will actually run up underneath the insulation and cause the wire to go hard. Now, to solder the new wire onto your motor, tin up the motor tab first, just make sure there's a bit of solder on there, and then warm up the wire with a tiny bit of solder. Come to the job and just touch it, and everything will melt at the same time and you have a joint. Try not to use too much solder, because too much solder can cause it to crack at a later stage. Right, when soldering motors into cars, never ever cut too much of the wire off and make it too short, because you need to have adjustment on the motor for pinion sizes and such the like, and if your wire is too short you're not going to be able to adjust the motor properly. So I always put a little bit of a loop in my wire, solder it on so there's just a little bit longer but still neat enough to keep it all apart. Get that all nice and hot, tapped on. Once it's done, keep a loop about 1 centimeter. Right, when sometimes somewhere along the line you're going to have to join two pieces of wire together. The best way to do it is use something that will steady one piece of the wire. I use in particular helping hands, which are fantastic, so that one piece of wire stays exactly where it is and you can move the other bit to where you need to. With insulation, I tend to use a shrink wrap type insulation. You can use tape, but this tends to be the better way because it's a lot more permanent. It doesn't get sticky and come loose. Now, to join the two pieces of wire together, you need to have tinned both bits first, and then with your iron just load it up a little bit with solder. Put the two wires end to end, not cross over but end to end, and with your soldering iron and a bit of solder on it, reheat the solder on the two pieces of wire and draw it across. Leave that to set, and there you have a join. All that's left now is just put your shrink wrap tubing or insulation tape over the joint. You can use a little lighter, but I prefer to use a heat gun, but it all does the same job. Shrinks it all nice and tight, seals it, and now you've got a longer piece of wire and it's nice and neat and it's not going to shock anybody. Sometimes when you're soldering wires onto motors and connectors and such alike, there could be too much solder on there for your liking. So what I use is a solder sucker, warm up the solder, put the solder sucker up against there and pull it all off and have a nice clean surface to start off with. So just remember, keep the tip of your iron hot, don't let the job get too hot, and have a lot of fun.